There's another way of working with a state design pattern, and that is to keep the state inside an object. Previously, you used methods and stored the state inside a variable named state, had different constants attached to it, and let the methods do all the work. And this time instead, you can actually store the state inside a variable named state and load that variable with different state objects. Then you can always just call the state object method on this variable named state, and the appropriate state response will occur because you have different state objects loaded into that state variable. So that's the idea. You're going to use different state objects now, and so the code, your main code could always stay the same. You always just execute the state methods on that state variable, but the response will be different because you have different objects inside, objects of different states inside that state variable. So to take a look at what we mean, we're going to present this example where the rental process is being performed by an automat, a little vending machine. And so now we're going to have this automat, and it's going to have a state variable inside there. That state variable will hold different types of state objects. Then all we have to do is call the state objects methods on that state variable, and depending on what state object is in that state variable, you get different responses. This is a different approach to working with the state design pattern. Okay, so let's take a look at how you might code this. This is going to be a little bit more involved than just working with methods. We're going to start by creating the automat, and start creating the automat by creating an automat interface. The automat interface has to have these methods to be able to interact with the user, with a potential renter. So the potential renter will want to approach the automat and call its getApplication method, for example, when it submits an application. The person submits an application, check application when they want the application to be checked, and so forth. So that's going to be part of our automat. And as such, we put those user interface methods into the automat interface. Internally, the automat is going to have to change its own state, and so it's going to have a set state method. The set state method will reload the state internal variable with the appropriate state object. In addition, there are 4 states, and we're going to have some utility methods in the automat. It says get waiting state. This gets a waiting state object. Get got application state. This gets a got application state object, and so forth. So these 4 methods allow you to get the objects corresponding to the different states. So those are utility methods, and the set state method will set the current state object being used inside the automat. So that's the interface. Now it's time to we can also add 2 utility methods. One is getCount. It returns the number of apartments available. SetCount sets the number of apartments available. So that completes the automat interface. Now we're going to implement the automat class. Implementing the automat interface in the automat class. Going to create these state objects. It's going to start by creating the state objects in the automat constructor, to which you pass the number of apartments available. This is going to be stored in a count variable. And then we have going to create 4 state objects corresponding to the different states. We have yet to construct these state classes, but we will next. This is the waiting state class, the got application state class, the apartment rented state class, and so forth. So we're going to create 4 state objects. And those will be loaded into a variable called named state, depending on what state the actual automat is in. And so now we have the variable named state, and we start off with state being assigned the waiting state object. That says that the automat is in the waiting state. Okay, so that's the way it works. You have different state objects, and then you load them into a state variable. And then there's going to be these various user interface methods. Got application, for example. Now all you have to do is say state.getApplication. Now the getApplication method returns a different result depending on whether or not you're in the waiting state, the getApplication state, or so forth. But since the state variable holds different state objects, all you have to do now is say state.getApplication. So the getApplication method interfaces with the user. This calls the state getApplication method. Now this state variable is going to hold different objects, depending on the internal state of the automat, but it makes these utility methods to interface with the user very easy, because all you have to do is say state.getApplication, state.checkApplication, and what's going to happen here is that this state is going to be different depending on what object is loaded into the state variable. Okay, and then finally let's add some utility methods here that will actually create the objects. This is the getApartmentRentedState that returns apartment rented state object, and getFullyRentedState method returns a fully rented state object, and so forth. There's the getCount and the setCount methods, and there you also have the setState method, and that will let you load the current state into state object. It will let you load the current state variable with a state object like this. So you can set the state, the internal state of the automat, calling the setState method. Next, we'll be creating the state classes themselves.